liberal in the matter of creation and regards to the scientists who do not believe in the theory of evolution. We have pointed out, of course, from these previous broadcasts that a man is within his rights to believe Genesis 1, 2, and 3 literally, because this is the only scientific viewpoint available. The scientists may laugh at this, but a crackpot fanatic who's about half crazy, his opinion is not to be considered worth very much anyway. After all, science is supposed to be a correlated body of absolute truth, which is demonstrable that you can demonstrate. Therefore, to a scientist to talk about the science of origins, such as the universe and the solar system and man, is diluted talk of a crackpot fanatic. We don't have to accept it, we don't have to tolerate it, it's just nonsense. By his own definition of his own branch he makes a living by, science, he is unscientific. So we accept as scientifically correct in every detail the account in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and discard the entire body of scholarship and scientific journal and reasoning and experiments since that time, under the grounds since they never accomplish anything anyway, there isn't much point particularly in believing what they have to say. Now somebody said, well, this caused the Dark Age business of the persecution of Galileo and Copernicus. No, we don't persecute anybody. That was a church that did that. You get your history straightened out. Every time you call the people's attention to the fact that the average scientist or physicist is a crackpot fanatic and a bigoted nut that doesn't know what he's talking about, then you run into these religious ecclesiastical bigots who think, well, back in the Dark Ages they opposed scientists, and now look, all we found out that science said was true that the church didn't think was true, such as the earth going around the sun. Well, suppose the sun went around the earth, what then? You see what I mean, Jelly Bean? Suppose you'd gotten to Venus or Jupiter, what then? You see, there's a great gap between the ecclesiastical bigot in a church who's trying to prevent knowledge from showing up and the Bible believer who knows a liar when he sees one. There's a big difference. And so we talk about scientific fact, we have to face the most demonstrable fact of all. And that is the fact that the entire body of scientists in Europe and America, working at breakneck pace for 400 years, have never solved one major problem of the human race. Now, don't you find that rather interesting? And before you make a god out of this clown of science and exalt him to the place where he does more than sell toothpaste ads, did you ever look at the demonstrable fact? Let's look it right straight in the face one time. Aside from giving some people jobs, and there always have been jobs available, and more jobs available with less scientific equipment than with the scientific equipment. When you computerize a thing, you put about 100 to 500 men out of work. I think we all know that. Now let's just face the fact, like big grown-up men and women and boys and girls, shall we? Let's face an existential fact of scientific empiricism that's so objective that no scientist in the world can discuss it. Fact. Of the major problems of mankind, poverty, famine, religious disunity, war, debt, disaster, the entire body of scientists working on 4 continents for 2,000 years have never solved one single problem. You said they're working on it. They've been working on it for 4,000 years. What's the point? Why, somebody said, well, do you realize what they've done, these vast strides? No, you don't know what you're talking about. You mean vast strides in communication and transportation? You say yes, which has brought about what? 37 wars in 20 years? Which has brought about what? The muzzling of free speech? What are you talking about? Did you know over 8/10 of this world doesn't have freedom of the press or freedom of speech because of the vast transportation and communication improvements? Did you know there are more people in slavery right now than there were in 1850? Did you know that? That can be proved statistically by people who've been in the prisons. There's more slave gang and slave labor of genuine slaves right now than there was in 1850. Due to what? Well, you tell me. Let's just face it. Aside from providing a few medicines and hospital care for rich folks who can afford it for certain diseases to alleviate suffering temporarily or prolonged death, science hasn't accomplished one thing since Galileo fell out of his crib. And who doesn't know that can observe observable, demonstrable fact? So they got to the moon. That took $25 billion a year of money to bring back a piece of dead rock. Now let's just face it, like big grown-up men and women, a man who accepts Genesis 1 to 3 as a scientific account is so far ahead of any scientist that doesn't, you couldn't talk about him in the same breath. A man who accepts the pipe dream of Disneyland evolution and Mickey Mouse evolution as taught by the leading evolutionists in America, let's just face it, he's just a deceived liar. And you say, well, can be proved in court? Why, of course. A high rumor of the Christian Science Research Foundation was taken to court on 8 counts of the Bible, and the plaintiff was thrown out of court on all 8 counts. The Christian Research Foundation has an offer of $1,000 to any man who can prove one scientific error in the Bible. They've been taken to court 8 times on it. You didn't read about that court trial with James Bennett in New York, did you? No, all you got was the Scopes monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee, where the hero of the press, the atheist Clarence Darrow, who told a young man to commit suicide because life wasn't worth living, made a fool out of himself publicly for the Civil Liberties Union, who were trying to push the Communist Party. The press has a funny way of putting things, don't they? Now let's just face it, and we shall face it. Aside, are you listening? Some of you turn it off there back because of your vicious prejudice against the truth. You said, I don't like the tone of your voice. I don't like the frame of your mind. Shall we start again? Aside from alleviating temporary suffering and prolonging life for a few rich people who can afford the hospital bill and the insurance, science has never solved one major problem of mankind since the first scientists sucked on a bottle. And the problems which were rampant in the days of Noah, Cain, and Abel are rampant today. And they're rampant today as they were in the days of Christopher Columbus, and rampant the days of Christopher Columbus as they were in the days of Solomon and David, Ezra, Nehemiah, and John the Baptist. And don't let these silly, deluded idiots kid you into thinking because they're moving faster and talking further, saying less, that science has done something. Science is a clown. And aside from providing a few people for jobs to make a living with, which the Army and Navy also supply, as well as the ditch diggers union and the truck drivers union, they have nothing to contribute at all. So in approaching Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3, the safest thing to do is accept it as a scientific account and take the conflicting accounts written and taught and preached by the faculty members of state universities and throw them in the wastebasket. They'll be in fit company.